The Riddle of Earth's Shape, from Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. The philosophers from Anaxagoras to Plato had concentrated upon the problem of designing a perfect state in theory, and that in turn meant to them an ideal city government. Plato had gone so far in his Republic as to develop a perfect model wherein aristocratic thinkers could exist with slave laborers to their mutual benefit. At Eza, the experimenters pointed out that Plato's city plan was the finest of Greek attempts to meet the problems of reality by an ideal solution. Aristotle, on the contrary, refused to speculate upon what might be the best form of government. He had limited his effort to an attempt to determine what had worked out best, and when, and how, and why. So his assistants were at work examining the constitutions and histories of all governments of record, and they had singled out more than 150. These included the various Greek cities, from the Athenian democracy or rule by the people to the Spartan military communistic state, or rule by a selected warrior group. Among the examples also appeared the tyranny of Crete, or rule by one head, and such oddities as the priesthood rule of the celebrated Delphic oracle, which supported itself by payments from visitors. Going far afield from the Greek cities, Aristotle was also examining the tribal communities across the great river Danube. He compared such rule by the leading family in the tribes to the reign of the pharaohs in Egypt. At first, the first, he believed, was a primitive form of the second. The barbarian tribes maintained themselves by an economy of war, raid, and some trade. So they were still devoted to the leadership of individual warriors, while the Egyptians sustained themselves by long-established agriculture and handwork, reaching a much higher intellectual level. Midway between these Danubian tribesmen, with the herds and huts, and the great metropolitan centers of Egypt, Aristotle placed his own people, the Macedonians. The Macedonians were still young, still barbaric. Only yesterday, in historic time, they had migrated down with their herds out of the northern forest and riverlands to these hills at the edge of the sea. They still retained the rude independence of a hunting people by constant struggle against the invading Scythian tribes and the highly equipped armies of the Greek cities. They had freedom in the sense that they had been made slaves, yet they were still subservient mentally to the educated Greeks and actually inferior to the more sophisticated Cretans, Egyptians, and Phoenicians. The Macedonians still had retained traces of tribal life. The kinsmen were no more than blood kin of the royal Amantus family. The companions, or individual nobles, consisted of the great landowning and cattle-breeding families. Any important question had to be decided by the meeting of the commanders of the army. Just as generations ago, the leading warriors had assembled in the council to decide what was the best to do for the tribe. And Aristotle's examination had raised some startling questions. It seemed as if different peoples had been shaped not so much by their government as by their physical surroundings, going back to the history of natural things. The assistants at Mysa pointed out, as a shore was eaten away or built up, fertilized or made barren by the actions of water upon it, so animals evolved according to the sources of food or conditions of safety or peril around them. And if you think the theory of evolution is going back far here, some of the non-philosophical religious texts take it back even further. Certainly, forest animals differed from those of the grass plains, while they in turn developed differently from the beasts of the desert regions. So in the case of man, herdsmen on half-barren hills did not develop as the dwellers within a fertile river valley. Apparently, a human group domiciled upon a natural stronghold evolved different ways of protecting, feeding, and sheltering themselves from those of a similar group settled upon an open shore. We're not quite talking about Marxism here. Had not the different Greeks all sprung from a common stock in tribal times? Had they not, thereupon, built many small cities separately because the peninsula of Hellas offered them only small and isolated valleys? For protection's sake, these Greeks had each built their separate stronghold or polis city. They had done so out of necessity, and not because in that pioneering stage they had believed the single city-state to be the ideal state. Moreover, developing in different ways, the cities facing upon the coast tended to rely on sea-borne trade and to hold most firm to democracy, or, well, I'm not sure they had democracy, but, some connection to the people, perhaps a republic, probably, because the building and handling of ships required the cooperation of the community. On shipboard, were not all men equal, like the ancient Argonauts, except that they chose someone for leader, while the land-bound cities tended towards aristocracy, or leadership by the elite few, who commanded or planned for the armies. These questions seem small and irritating besides the grandeur of Plato's ideal city. Moreover, they hinted that the fortunes of a people did not depend on fate alone. And it really didn't depend on the type of government alone, did it? As for the Macedonians, it was apparent that they had developed no such elaborate city-state, since Aga and Pella were no more than poorly sited towns without trade, dignity, or the great academies of the more advanced Greek centers. The Macedonians had been confined to peasant life and animal breeding because they had been cut off from the trade routes and even from the coast itself. There seemed, according to Aristotle's reasoning, no possibility of making Pella into such a city as Athens. In fact, he laid down no rules by which a people could progress or a city be well governed, while he pointed out that the environing country influenced a city's wealth. Well, influenced the city's growth as well, too, right? And the energy of its inhabitants, its welfare, he left unanswered. The questions towards what should it progress. Nor would he admit that its future was predetermined by fate or the will of the entities. Yet, Alexander sensed the answer towards which the Stagirite was working with infinite patience. If human beings could be shaped by their environment, they could change themselves in equal measure by their own efforts. If so, they would not be dependent on fate. Aristotle was working with reality, divided down to its smallest atom, and he, Alexander, had evolved a dream world, real only to his imagination, and then only because it lay out of human sight. Among the 150 cases, Aristotle made a notation upon Thebes that the city had been raised above the others in the last generation by the supreme ability of one man, Epaminondas, who had created a victorious army and had known how to gather in the fruits of victory. For the organization of a peace after war is more difficult than the winning of a war, and in discussing city rule, politics. Linguistically, let's remember that politics rests between polite and citizenship. So it's really something for everybody, regardless of your system. He made a further note: if there exists in a state a person so far above others in virtue that neither the virtue nor the political ability of any other citizen is comparable with his, he will be wronged if treated as their equal. Such a man should be held to be as a god among men. Well, people treat all sorts of things as gods, don't they? In reading this, it seemed to Alexander that the Stagirite believed the spark of divinity lay still within human beings. He was deep in a study of the influence of the sea power upon the overseas expansion of the Athenian state, when a rider from the companions appeared at Mysa and entered his cell. The horseman said that Alexander would join the main army on its march along the nearer sea. Engrossed as he was in making notes, Alexander replied that he would be ready to leave at the end of the month. "You are leaving with me today," the rider informed him. "This is an order." Instead of making preparations to depart, Alexander, exasperated, threw away his notes. And as I get rumbly in the tumbly, is it? No, it's not time to break to divide this into two. Threw away his notes, caught up his sleeping robe, his copy of Homer, and his knife, and started out to get the black horse, saying in that case he was ready now. He never returned to Mysa as a student. If Philip had brought his son from Pella to remove Alexander from Olympias's influence, he did not say so. The one-eyed leader of the Macedonians never spoke about his wife, nor did he mention Cleopatra to his son. This gulf of silence between them Philip might have abridged, but Alexander could not. Nor did Philip himself try to instruct the student from Mysa how to behave when he joined the Macedonian field army. The Macedonians marched. They marched in drifting dust along the coastal King's Way and over great paths, 20 miles and sometimes 23. They covered between the dawn trumpet and the sunset meal. With full equipment and 5 days' rations, they marched faster than any Greek phalanx, outdistancing the news of their coming, and no distance covered seemed to satisfy the impatient Philip. When his Macedonians were on the march, Philip circulated through the columns as they limped around his building projects in Pella. Having apparently neither tent nor headquarters of his own, at night he could be found guzzling by a teamster's fire, or gossiping with the advancing cavalry patrol. It's interesting how my stomach chooses to growl at parts at moments that could possibly be seen dramatically connected to the text or something. If Alexander had fancied that he would be given a white mantle and the gold-adorned chest armor of an Achilles to wear, riding Bucephalus with the elite companion cavalry, he was rudely enlightened. He marched with the transport wagons, clear of their dust, carrying his pack and shouldering the responsibility of men and animals and loads. Sweating and swearing, he fought against time to gain distance, struggling with the strange circumstance that a company could not or would not move as fast as one man, and that a line of carts could be held up by one broken wheel. He discovered that horses did not haul their weight unless fed and cared for in legs, hooves, and guts. Luckily, he was a hardened walker and stubborn. These Macedonians marched, but not in any apparent direction, or for any discernible purpose. At times they loitered on the open coast, swimming and doctoring the horses. At other times they kept on without stopping for a day and a night. They encircled a seaport and made all preparations for a siege, only to march away when a fleet appeared at the anchorage. By night they moved into a city only to give it up and to start elsewhere. Seldom did the teamsters of transport get up close enough to see what the head of the column might be doing. On the day that Cleopatra visited the column, they halted and held races, horse and foot, and wrestling bouts with wine served after. The teamsters swore that Cleopatra was a fortunate girl. Alexander saw her at the games. And in Egyptian you have, what is it? I know it's a Q, Cleopatra, something like that. Wearing a half veil over the loose knot of her curled brown hair, close wrapped in a single peplos without a cloak, swaying as she walked, a girl of 14 at the heels of her uncle Attalus, who pushed arrogantly ahead of other men. Still, Cleopatra kept her eyes half closed, demurely. In passing Alexander, she glanced up, as if measuring his strength, then gave a skip, hurrying after Attalus. Small and weak she might be, yet Cleopatra, the niece of Attalus, had the look of Olympias about her. Well, we don't need to mention Freud because you know what I'm talking about. That night she poured wine for Philip, and the soldiers wagered whether she would go into bed with him. They offered tetradrachmas against drachmas. She would not, estimating that she was an ambitious virgin, holding herself for a great price. Well, haven't we heard that Philip is a rapist? So, if no one's there to protect her, you know. Then they offered Alexander fruit, which he took, and wine, which he disliked, because they were vaguely aware that Philip's son should have been invited to the feast instead of being left to mess with them. These soldiers, as Alexander discovered, knew much about the whims, habits, and abilities of the commanders, discussing them without mercy, calling Philip the one-eyed fox and the lame goat. February is like, if you the zodiac animal of February is the goat. So see, there's good reason why I picked to do this. At all times, whether foraging or fighting or bathing, they grumbled. Mostly they complained of short rations, scant pay, prohibitions against looting, the coast towns, and the state of the roads, which they had to repair as they advanced eastward towards the Dardanelles. Of Philip they complained that he had kept them in the field during the harvest and planting time, and expected them to carry the loads of mules, yet they seemed to find sense in the twisting and turning of the marching. Philip, they argued, was trying to get hold of the seacoast ports for Macedon, which had been cut off from the sea by these Greek trading settlements. When the Spartan fleet put in and the army marched away, they had an explanation. The fox didn't want to waste men in a hot siege now that the city was reinforced. No, he would take another city someplace else and trade it with the Spartans for that one. The fox always had a new trick to play, and he would waste gold bullion rather than loss of life, which the army thought a most important matter, and he would use up his new machines before he would send men into battle. They explained this, taking care that Alexander understood, since he might command a regiment before long. And nowadays, the leaders are willing to have millions of people die, even in their own army. So they were resting on the path above the grey water of Dardanelles, trying to make out the round hills of Troy. Or is it true? Because if it's Omicron Ulipsa, then it's true, in Asia, across the way. When an officer of the Agema, the favored companies that served as a guard for the king commander, laid odds against Alexander's chances of commanding the army itself, the gambler Hephaestion by name was young and reckless, with the fine manner of an Athenian. He said trade had been the ruin of his family, so he had sold his sword into service. He had a way of mocking at sacred things, even money. He offered that Alexander would never be king, not realizing that he spoke of a man who stood beside him. For it all depends on Philip's whim, and the fox is not pleased with his girlish, bookish offspring, and he might get him another one. What do you say? The men said nothing, waiting to hear how Alexander might break out at Hephaestion. They knew that the carefree captain of the Agema was blood kin to the king's son. Moreover, Hephaestion pointed out, our kinsmen, except that Tudor milk-sucker Leonidas, having a feeling against the son of the woman they think to be a witch, and counting Philip out, his army isn't minded to obey anyone except the generals. Those are my points. Who of you teamsters has hard money to lay against me? Now, of course, one of the things here is that if she's working with the jinn or wants to be dealing with the jinn, it's appropriate to call her a witch. Alexander was looking through the haze over the grey water, seeing red creep into the haze as blood pounded through his veins, when a runner came down the column and stopped before him, saying that the king commander had been hurt. Philip had sent for his son. Hephaestion looked once carefully at Alexander, hesitated, and drew his short sword, balancing it on the palm of his hand. It was 1 chance in 10,000 I should pick you to wager with, but I lose, and here it is. He smiled, his dark eyes mocking. Don't make me wait while you make formal complaint of my insubordination. I don't want a hearing. Alexander? He could not have thought out a better way to save his life. Alexander sensed the recklessness of the captain and felt Hephaestion had appealed to him. He touched the sword hilt awkwardly. I don't want a burial here, he said, because of a few words. Philip's hip had been broken in a skirmish up the road, and he lay on a stretcher where water flowed from a shrine's font, with his legs stretched out, tied to a javelin. Nor would he let Alexander feel around the broken bones. If it's not necessary for medical things, when you're hurt like that, More delay, he grumbled, wiping the sweat from his eyes. We won't see Pella before snow comes, and I'm not going back like this. His glance leveled on his son's face. What's this new rumor that you're wishful to rule in Pella while I manage the army? Would that be to your liking? Parmenio, chief of the staff, and the silent Antipater were listening. If Philip had called them in, it meant that he was having his son judged upon some doubtful point. Head tilted, his blue eyes troubled, Alexander explained that he would like best to go back to the studies from which he had been taken. As to the talk in Pella, he knew nothing of it. It's all through the camp, down to the ranks, doing as much harm as a plague. As always, Philip's staccato speech followed the swift current of his thoughts. The peasantry, the phalanxmen, like you, and they are hard as devils to please. Did you know that? No, sir. A side glance towards the two silent commanders assured Philip that Parmenio did not believe Alexander, while the matter-of-fact Antipater did. I've been away too long from Pella, he muttered, easing his leg. Can't be helped, but it can be helped. That gossip has sense in it, after all. Yes, you can go back instead of me. Abruptly, the wounded Macedonian chuckled. I'm serious, boy. Don't bury yourself in a doctor's den. He still thought of his son as a medical student, but go back and do the honors for me at Pella. In my name, of course. As if pleased with his new thought, Philip explained to the commanders that from this moment, the 17-year-old Alexander was appointed regent. During his absence from the city, Alexander started to object and thought better of it. Just what authority are you going to give me, and what do you expect me to do? Impatiently, because the broken bones in his hip tormented him, Philip handed his son the small royal seal with the lion's image on it. Full authority, make payments, sign letters, but be careful about making promises. Don't ask me what to do. Find out for yourself what you can do. Didn't I lay out a cartload of gold so that Aristotle might teach you? Consult with him about politics. Take along a military advisor too. Take Antipater here. You'll need an escort now, so pick a company of the foot agema. Neither Aristotle nor Antipater will sell you out, boy, and the army will see you. Don't get in a scrape over a girl. And, he added thoughtfully, you'll have to strike some more coins from the mine bullion for cash. Now, I don't think the Greeks referred to people like they were children if they weren't children, but don't just fight for the sake of, well, get in a fight, defend women. I'm not saying that, definitely, but not just some, competition thing, And he added thoughtfully, you have to strike some more coins from the mine bullion for cash. With his orders given, Philip hesitated, not knowing how to show personal feeling to his son. At that moment, Alexander would have chosen to stay with the wounded man and the troops. Kiss me and farewell, Philip muttered. His dry lips touched his son's cheek, and Antipater motioned the boy to leave, tucking the seal absently into his girdle. Alexander wondered if he had been dismissed because he had failed at soldiering, or whether Philip actually wanted him at Pella. He felt a surge of gratitude, realizing his father had defied gossip by honoring him openly, but he had no illusions about his ability to manage the affairs at Pella. Later, Olympius declared that Philip, who was infatuated with the girl Cleopatra, had wanted to be rid of his son, especially when he found out that Alexander was becoming a favorite with the troops. When he started the journey home with Antipater the following sunrise, he remembered Hephaestion and named that reckless individual to be his guard officer. Hephaestion towered above Alexander, who was tall enough. This young aristocrat had the strength of a Heracles and the easy laughter of a Dionysos. Whether drunk or sober, in most respects he was the very opposite of the single-minded student, relishing fights more than sports, and the wine-cup best of all. Where Alexander worried himself into black depression over difficulties, Hephaestion took no thought of them, preferring to play the flute instead. Philosophy he dismissed with a grin, quoting Euripides, "We are slaves of the gods, wherever they be." In proof, he cited his own elevation from culprit to commander of the prince's guard within half an hour. If that isn't a miracle, show me a better one.